downhill of arrows. I can promise that in my presentation there are no arrows involved, so sort of a process of decantilization. And I'll be talking about the wealth, accounting, and evaluation of ecosystem services, a global partnership led by the World Bank with others. And we are being asked to talk about this specific framework in the context of informing policy and practice. I will propose to organize a talk around four major pillars. One is talking a bit about what is waves, what the framework does it use, and why have we chosen this framework, and finally, what policy questions can be used for. And then my colleague Ulrich Narain from Washington will give more flavor in terms of the applications and the tangible use of this partnership. Before going into what is waves, and following a bit on what has been discussed this morning and Georgina, the context is very important to understand in terms of decision of waves is a follow-up. There was the ME assessment, there was some agreement on the undervaluation of natural capital as a major cause for biodiversity loss. Then there was some work on valuation on TIP. But in this specific platform, the idea is how do we convince Minister of Finance, how do we talk and approach central banks and planning agencies that have at stake issues related to the sustainable and management of natural capital. And in 2010, in Nagoya, October, the former president of the World Bank, Bob Zilek, presented this partnership as a global partnership that involves countries from the developing world and developed world, UN agencies, such as the UNEP, UNDP, UN Statistical Commission, and other partners. And the idea is to promote sustainable development by ensuring that natural resources are mainstreamed in terms of national accounts, national economic accounts, and development planning. So this is the major picture. So to bring the endorsement of this color, of this dimension to this high level of national governments. And there are three major objectives in particular. One is to do with the establishment of the environmental accounts in 6 to 10 countries, which we call implementing partners, and incorporate those accounts into national policy analysis and development program. This is something to be, this exercise should be, have a merit on its own, but should be also then be part of the decision making in terms of national policy and development planning. We also work on one of the objectives that has to do with development of international guidelines for ecosystem accounting, which is a different, let's say, color within the natural resources. One has to do with natural capital, one has to do with ecosystem accounting. I'll go to that later on more deeply, sorry. And then has to do with the spread of the news and basically putting environmental accounting going beyond this exercise of these selected countries. Having said that, the idea that the framework we use in terms of wealth has to do with the fact that, and if we borrow this line of reasoning for companies, we don't only look at the income statement of a company. So if you want to invest in the company, you look at the income, what it produces in 1 year, but also the assets, so the balance sheet, what the company owns. And these two elements are important to figure out the performance of the company in terms of the short term, but also in terms of the long term. And we borrow the same kind of reasoning for a country. So why do we assess a country economic progress on the basis of national income, GDP alone, which is one measurement, it's one color, it's one dimension for economic progress, but it's not the only one. Okay? And in this context, the idea would be to integrate the different sources of income in terms of well-being and wealth, in terms of manufactured capital, in terms of natural capital, intangible capital, and altogether be sources of the income. So borrowing this framework to the context of national accounting, we have a more inclusive way. So the wealth has to do with these different sources of capital from manufactured, natural, and human and social. This has been done by many, let's say, agencies, including the World Bank and the UNEP, and there are some elements and some recent publications that has been tackle these issues and producing information, like the changing wealth of the nation by the World Bank in 2011. It was 1 year before the partnership was implemented, and the Inclusive Wealth Report as presented last year in Rio by UNEP. There's some differences in methodology, but all in all, they look into the wealth accounting. In the domain of natural capital accounting, basically you look at one dimension of the wealth, which has to do with the natural resources, and we try to develop a framework for implementation of these, including ecosystem services. And the ultimate objective, is to bring these dimensions into national account settings. Okay? So there are a set of rules and protocols to follow, and these are going to be set in a way that the information generated by this dimension can be read along national capital accounts. And this has been a process discussed for a long time by UN Statistical Commission with national and international agencies. And today, we have in our hands a system of environmental and economic accounting, which is a process that has been for the last 30 years, and has a set of tools, like the central framework, which has been already decided and agreed among UN partners to implement this kind of operations. In the context of waves, what we try to do in one hand is to implement the C standards and piloting the C in terms of ecosystem accounts. And not necessarily everything has to be done in monetary terms. So there is also biophysical measurements and assessments. And also here, one of the objectives is also to shed light in terms of distribution of benefits, or I'll say in terms of beneficiaries, and the beneficiaries shared, and understand how those different stakeholders interface with the benefits, with the ecosystem service and the benefits carried by natural capital sets. And also able to value these assets, which are at the end as a source of income generation. There have been some issues being addressed in this platform, ranging from the prioritization of ecosystem service, because we have scarce resources, we cannot start with everything, so we have to make where we have to start first, and also putting at stake different evaluation techniques, especially in the context of ecosystem service, where there is no general agreement on how to proceed. So, and why this framework? So we have a portfolio of frameworks that we could do, could embrace. Why going for a natural capital accounting one? One way of looking into things is basically looking into alternative and potentially better indicators for monitoring sustainable development. And most probably GDP will not be the most efficient candidate to give some idea how things are going. So we try to basically revisit this indicator and look into it in more detail in terms of sustainable development. And we can also create indicators about water, energy, productivity indicators, and see how they're improving over time. So how you're using this natural capital. This is an example that I borrowed from the book that I mentioned in the first place. It's about an adjusted net savings. So the bottom line is that we start with a figure which is commonly outset in terms of GDP. And basically, on that figure, we take into account other measurements regarding, in this case, depreciation of capital. So it has to do with capital, something to do with investment in human capital, and also resources and pollution. And what you see is, when you start with the measure which is publicly available, like GDP, and you take into account all the other elements of capital or dimensions, a country, or instead it's basically a set of countries in the sub-Saharan Africa for 2008, you have something was reported as plus 15, you can get basically a negative value. And this negative value is adjusted net savings. And this basically may be a sort of a traffic light indicator saying that most probably the way you are going is not the most sustainable way. Even if you look at the short-run GDP figure, you say that it looks fine. But basically, you're just depleting what you have at home, in particular in terms of fixed capital and then also the natural resources, which is the most impacted elements. Another thing that you can think about, policy questions can be used with this framework, and has been already discussed this morning, has to do with better management of natural capital and growth and poverty reduction. And this can be of particular importance in the context of low income countries because there is a higher dependence of those communities or the communities of those countries with natural capital. And basically, if you have an understanding about the real contribution of natural capital to their livelihoods, most probably you are able to endorse those policies in a different way. Simultaneously, you can also weigh trade-offs among competing users, for example, water, forest, and land use. And this goes very much hand in hand with the elegant the presentation of my colleague before myself. And you can have this information to feed those discussions and understand how can you get to negotiations in a more inclusive and coordinated way. Because for sure the trade-offs for some communities will be welfare, no welfare improvement. Another interesting thing for finance, and not only for finance, is you have information or have a rationale. You can have a financial rationale for financial investments or investments in natural capital, like protected areas or MPAs or forests in general, become an asset for which you have a flow. And then you can also have development of strategies and policies to improve resource efficiency and clean production. And I will add here, to conclude, also the fact that in countries where most of the economic development is based on natural resource industry, you have information about the rents that this industry is creating to the country, and maybe you can also improve your economic policy and your taxation policy regarding the use of those natural resources. I will finish here